Oh, I didn't think that was turned on. Right, let me pause that. Come on, computer. Right, welcome everybody. Welcome to our 1 o'clock webinar today, the second of our 3 EcoChurch webinars. The first one that you might have come to last week was all about getting started. And this week we're looking at how do we work towards an award and maintain momentum. In terms of quick bits of housekeeping, as usual, I'll be using the Q&A function for the questions rather than the chat. So if you can move your mouse around, find the Q&A, that's where to put your questions in. You'll also find other people's questions there, and you can click the thumbs up next to anyone else's questions, and the ones with the most thumbs up rise to the top, and that's where Helen and I will focus our time at the end. After the webinar, I send everybody the slides and I send any links that go in the chat, and also a link through to a very short feedback form to know whether we're hitting the spot. We're running these webinars again in the autumn, so your feedback really is very useful. And we also are recording the webinar, and the recordings will go onto our website. It takes us a few days to manage that process, but they do appear on our website, on the same page where you booked on in the first place. Future attractions, if you are interested in our webinars, next week we have got the third of the webinar series on working towards net zero carbon. Then in the middle of July, we've got a webinar on heat pumps for those of you thinking about the future of the heating in your church and how you might be able to move away from oil and gas. That one's very relevant. And then in September, we've got our twin webinars on environmental fundraising. The first part is on opportunities, and the second part is on how to go about starting your environmental fundraising. But we want to move on to the main event, which is Helen Stephens talking to us about EcoChurch. Helen is the expert on the EcoChurch programme. You've supported hundreds of churches around the country and seen them go through their EcoChurch journey. Helen is the Church Relations Manager at A Rocha UK, who are the charity behind the whole EcoChurch programme. And if you haven't come across me before, my name's Catherine Ross, and I'm one of the staff who work on the Church of England's Environment programme, based in the Cathedral and Church Buildings Division. Right, let me stop sharing my screen and hand over to Helen to share hers and take us off.
Thank you, Catherine, and hello to you all.
Well, I'll just say to people, once you get your slides, Helen and I are very conscious there's a little bit of noise from the fan on her laptop, which is why she's trying with the microphone today. You can sometimes hear the noise. Sometimes it comes through on the microphone. We've done our best. I'm just letting you know so that you know it's at our end and not your end if you're joining the webinar and hear that sound.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Catherine. And yeah, we'll see how this headset goes today. I feel like a bit like an air traffic controller. So if I start waving my arms around, please forgive me, but hopefully the sound will be slightly improved. Well, hello and welcome back if you joined us last week, but good to have you with us today if you're here for the first time. I'm not going to repeat hopefully any of what I covered last week about getting started, but we are going to go into EcoChurch and some of the categories in a little bit more depth today, as we think about working towards an award and also maintaining a momentum to keep us going. So in the next hour or so, I wanted to start off thinking about how we set a positive vision and what your vision for your church might be with creation care at its heart, or at the core of who you are as church, because I think as much as we can do EcoChurch to get an award, really what's at the heart of EcoChurch is about trying to transform our church communities to care for creation as a fundamental part of who we are as Christians and in our churches, whatever expression of church that might be. A bit more in-depth look at planning, so how we might start, or indeed if we've started, how we might carry on. Some quick wins. I can't go through all the categories in detail. There are lots of questions in each, but I just want to pick out some that you could perhaps wrap your arms around. And as I do that, I'm also going to highlight some examples from some other churches that have already got to bronze, a couple in there that are silvers. And then we should have some time at the end for questions and answers. I hope you don't mind us starting with another poll. The wording that will come up in front of you has slightly changed, and there's an extra bullet above going for gold. Sorry, no, there's another bullet other. So there we go. Thank you, Catherine. Could you just please let us know if you haven't registered, or you've registered but you've not got an award? Maybe you've got a bronze but you're stuck on a couple of areas. Maybe you have a bronze and you're working towards silver. You might be going for gold or other. So please just tick one of those, the most appropriate one.
Nearly everybody has voted already. We've got 43 of 47. Give it just a few more seconds and then I'll end the polling. Right, we'll call that it, end polling, and share the results.
Oh, okay, thank you, that's really helpful. All right, so the majority of you are in the haven't registered or have registered but have not yet got an award category. One of you is going for gold, that is tremendous, but no, all great, that's really helpful. Thanks, Catherine. Hopefully this will be pitched where you're expecting it today then. Slides have got stuck. So EcoChurch, here is the website address, and just to emphasize again that it is very much a framework for action. Where I wanted to start today was actually picking up on a question that somebody asked at the end of the session last week, which is it possible just to do EcoChurch as a tick box exercise for it to just become sort of a thing in itself? And it is possible to take that approach. We could use the survey and get through it and so on, get our award, and it's possible that it could affect just a few people within church, and that is not the intention. Really, the whole ethos of it is, as it says at the bottom of this slide, to demonstrate that the gospel that we believe in as Christians is good news for the whole earth, and to put creation care at the heart and centre of who we are, for it to be missional. So I wanted to start with vision, actually, and wherever you're at right now, I suspect your church has a vision. It just so happens that in my church, we've got a new vicar who is about to set a new vision, which is probably what people do when they're new to an organisation. And funnily enough, my previous curate, who's now a vicar in another church nearby, was also doing her vision setting just this Sunday. And it made me think, what is our vision as we go into EcoChurch? And this picture here is taken by a photographer, Kieran Dodds, and it's actually of a forest church in Ethiopia. And I first heard of these churches just a couple of years back, and I don't know a lot about them, I must admit, but I just find this such a compelling image. Ethiopia has lost 95% of its native forests due to human activity in the last 100 years. But there are some Orthodox churches where they have appointed themselves guardians of the forest, if you like, and their church buildings are often in the middle of these patches of forest, and they look after and care for the forest as though it was a natural extension of their church and their community. From Kieran's website, it says, to their guardians, each forest is a miniature Garden of Eden and essential to the dignity of the building. And I think there are some tens and tens of these churches in the north of the country, all sort of preserving, protecting their heritage and biodiversity. And so I just thought, imagine that our church, that your church could become a beacon in its community. And it might not be as stark an image as this, that we've got barren land around us, although in many respects we have, because we know that we're losing biodiversity at a rapid rate. Just a reminder, I think I said last time that 1 million species are facing extinction over the next few decades. And so in our churches, really whatever we do to look after the earth can act as a beacon and be a place of good practice, of best practice. This image was from a recent gold submission from Salisbury Cathedral. It's a montage that they did together in the cathedral. And please bear with me, but I just wanted to read to you this little extract from their submission. And I appreciate that Salisbury Cathedral is probably at one end of the spectrum in terms of the size and the significance of the building. But for all of us, we are in our own local contexts, and this very much reflects theirs. So this is what the canon had written. The economy of Salisbury was still smarting from the poisonings when the first lockdown began on another March day in 2020. Since then, our problems have been those of the nations and the world's, not least in preserving jobs and those of every church, worshipping God and caring for God's people, while pointing to God's presence and purposes in these unparalleled days of pandemic. This again stalled our environmental work as thoughts narrowed once more to those of survival. But then came a renewed impetus. Here, as elsewhere, sweeter air and rediscovered birdsong have brought a fresh sense of the gift God has entrusted to us and its fragility. Having had to abandon our chapter's aim of applying for gold in 2020, we found that making an application in this year has been tough, but timely. We have been a COVID vaccination centre. Some 35,000 injections have been administered under the cathedral roof. And we must be no less committed to the healing of God's earth. And Canon Robert Titley, who wrote that, is a priest and a beautiful writer, but I just thought that so encapsulates a little bit of where they've come from in the last year or two, but the vision that they have of going forward, that they want to be committed to healing God's earth. Elsewhere, they'd made a reference to their history. Actually, as an 800-year-old cathedral, they've got very little embedded carbon because of the way in which the 13th and 14th century builders and stonemasons worked at the time. They were also imaginative recyclers. So, for example, the masons would find the gaps between stones packed with oyster shells, the fast food packaging of their day. And I read that and thought, what a lovely link to the present day where, and I'll mention it a little bit further on today, where we now have churches making eco-bricks out of empty crisp packets and bread bags and so on, stuffed into plastic bottles that can be then used in the construction. I can't think that they'd be such an attractive thing to find in hundreds of years' time rather than the oyster shells. But it is that lovely sort of threading of story through our churches in terms of where we've come from and where we want to go that I think is important to take time to stop and think about. Actually, wherever we are in our church journey, if you've started already. In terms of practically getting started, All Saints in Leighton Buzzard took the approach of going and asking their church community, firstly, how many of them were aware of the Anglican Communion's fifth mark of mission, which is to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of earth. Sorry, the quality of the slide is not particularly clear. 30%, 1/3, had heard of it. Actually, there's an argument that it's relevant to all the other marks of mission, but the point being they were just trying to sort of check, I guess, where the congregation was at. Then they asked them about their lifestyle and what people are doing already. 90% were recyclers, 30 to 40% were using renewables or organic or growing their own fruit and veg. Actually, 50 to 60% were trying to drive less and to avoid flying. They then asked for good ideas, and that's sort of in the middle of the slide. And then they asked for suggested actions for All Saints. So 73% wanted to focus on reducing waste, almost 60% to pray about it. also things in there about doing more on renewables and focusing on energy saving. And by that, they got some traction straight off from the church in trying to set that direction of travel. So they, yeah, sorry, this is a little bit of a repeat of what was on the slide before. Then, and I thought this was beautiful, they asked the question, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, from Psalm 24. And they asked people, what do you understand by this verse from the Psalm? And then they created this beautiful sort of wordle image from people's responses. And you can see words in there for yourself, but ones like sacred and responsibility and respect and privilege and so on. And I just thought that is a beautiful way of getting people started and engaged and sharing together. And they have gone on to do a lot from there in their church, and they got their bronze. I'm trying to remember, I think it was just last year. The other one I wanted to highlight, I don't expect you to read all the detail of this just now, but it's a mind map that the chair of the Eco group in a church in Sheffield produced a few months ago. And she took sort of the broad sections of EcoChurch, a little bit broader. She's got a section in there on policy specifically, and also on fundraising and gifting. But one of the reasons for pulling this out was just to emphasise how many sources of information and help there are around us. So I think the green documents in here, where she's got policy and church grounds, she's actually flagging a practical path document pack produced by Catherine, the Open and Sustainable Churches Officer. So she's made reference there to those resources that are available. The purple one is where they've looked through the survey and they've captured things that they can do, or things that they already, or things they already are doing. And then the blue ones are things that came out of a diocesan synod environmental motion. So she's got under policies, aim for net zero emissions by 2030, with progress reporting to the Environment Working Group for the diocese, and then engaging with the revised Environment and Justice Policy. And I flag those really to say to you that if you're in, whether you're in an Anglican church or a URC and you've got a synod, or a Methodist church and you're meeting at perhaps a circuit and district level, with denominational award schemes that we're also now operating, eco-diocese, eco-synod, eco-district and so on, it's very often the case that policies are being set elsewhere in the church that hopefully in our local churches we could use to draw on, to point to reinforce actions that we're trying to take. So I just encourage you to also find out what else might be going on in your diocese or your synod, or whatever it might be. Time for another poll before we get into the categories in a bit more depth. So Catherine, please, if you could just bring this one up, and do check the wording just may have changed a little. There we go. So of the 5 categories, worship and teaching, buildings, land, community and global engagement, lifestyle, are there any of those or all of those that you're struggling with? Is it that there are other priorities in the church that are perhaps getting in the way? Are you struggling, feeling that there's a lack of support and people to make it happen? Or maybe there's something else, and please do share it in the chat. Thank you.
I'm watching the results coming in. We're up to 34 people, so just give it a little bit longer. Nearly everybody now, 43 out of 48. And it's definitely slowing down.
This is always the point that I dread, where everybody says buildings. I think, oh no. It's not my area of expertise, but we will do the best we can. There's a lot we can do on our buildings without being buildings experts.
think that's probably everyone, because the number has stopped. So I'll end polling and share the results.
Okay.
The results. There we go.
Okay. So buildings, yeah, they've scored highly, which I sort of expect. 20 out of 43 of you said that's either holding you back or is challenging, and also not enough support and people to make it happen. Okay, and yeah, other priorities getting in the way also. Yeah, high score there. Okay, that's interesting too. So I guess the next question is what some of those priorities are. But do feel free to share those in the chat actually, and we can maybe pick up on them later on in the questions section. Thank you, that's helpful. And I think we've got... Pardon, Catherine?
I stop sharing the results of that one?
Yes, please. And then we've got one more, haven't we, I think?
Yep.
So what is helping you build momentum? I've deliberately phrased this one in a positive way, just to help you to think. Is it that there is a greater collective awareness, for example, because of David Attenborough, putting it so firmly on all our agendas, including the G7? Maybe it is that you've heard from your diocese or your synod or whatever, encouraging you to make progress. Maybe it's other churches that are encouraging you. Is it that you have an eco team already actually and you're finding that that's really working well? Leadership and involvement of young people. I know we don't all have young people in our churches, but there are usually young people in our community and in our schools. Or something else.
That's up to 35 people. Just give it another minute. And if you've got time whilst we're doing that to have a look at the chat, Helen, quite a few people have got some interesting answers in there to the previous question about the barrier.
Thank you for flagging that. If I could just find it without managing to get rid of my...
Yeah, it's too hard whilst sharing your screen, don't worry.
Oh no, was that just...
Oh, I shouldn't have given you one more thing.
Don't worry. That's
voting on this one slowed down, so I think I will end the polling and share the results. And there's a very clear winner in this one.
There is, isn't there? Yes. Thank goodness he's already been knighted. Yeah. No, it's not. I think it's, yeah, not to make light of it. It has been significant just how much more media attention there has been. The Blue Planet series, the recent series that I can never remember the names of. There have been some this year, and I think Sir David has been more and more punchy really in what he's saying and what he's calling for, and that's really helpful. And actually people of all faiths and none are hearing his message. That's encouraging about support from diocese synod circuits. And then also for those of you, 17 of you who've got an eco team, and I guess I partly wanted to highlight that for those of you that maybe don't have a team, that perhaps the next thing to think about is how you can pull a team of people together. And it might be that doing something like going through the survey in your church and trying to find people who've got particular areas of interest who might be willing to step in and help to lead on some of those sections, for example, and involving the young people. And I'll talk shortly about an example of that, where that's worked well in the church. Thanks, Catherine, that's really helpful. Thank you all for replying. So I just do want to go through each of the categories and to pull out a couple of questions from the survey on each of these, and also perhaps highlight as we go through this different approaches that different churches have taken. And for those of you who are just getting started, Actually, you've got a perfect time coming up in just a few months' time as we enter creation time in September and the first week of October. And this has really risen in popularity in the last few years. So the very first question of the very first category is about special Sundays relating to caring for God's earth being celebrated in our church. And probably harvest is one that's most common to us all. But the whole time of creation time in September is just a beautiful point to create a service around this and maybe incorporate with harvest, but not necessarily so, just to really focus on all that we have and receive through creation. We also have the upcoming COP26 talks in Glasgow in November, and it could be that if you haven't held a Climate Sunday service yet, that would also be a very timely thing to do. That's a great place to get started. So coming up soon, perhaps on the back of today, you could start to think about planning a service, or you might have one booked already. Praying for environmental issues. If you remember back to All Saints, Leighton Buzzard, I think 59% of the people who'd responded to their survey said they thought they could all pray more about what they were doing. That's a great reminder to us all, actually. You know, I don't think in my church we're praying for environmental issues anywhere near like weekly, but there is so much that we could be praying for all the time, and so related to other issues that we would naturally want to pray for. So the COP talks I've mentioned, that gives you, if you like, an international prayer focus. This is about trying to tackle climate change across the globe over the next few years, looking at revisiting the Paris 2015 targets and how countries have got on, but ultimately wanting the government and our government to go much further, much faster. There's the Environment Bill currently going through Parliament, which is all about, hopefully, trying to clean up the country's air, restore natural habitats and increase biodiversity. We could be praying for that, as well as perhaps asking our MPs where that's going, and sort of saying just how important we recognise that it is. And then your local environment, perhaps do a prayer walk locally in your community and see what you notice. Are there, you know, is there a lot of litter or graffiti or whatever it might be? Equally, are there areas of your local environment that you absolutely love and you can give thanks for? So I think prayer is a really great one to do in the worship and teaching section too. I won't spend too long on this because I know that those of you that answered on the categories, it's really encouraging that so many churches score so highly on the worship and teaching, and it really is foundational. I just wanted to mention briefly St. Peter's eco team in Woolton. What I pulled out from their response was, so they got their bronze last October, and when they started in their first year last year of looking to achieve bronze, silver and then gold, they found that they were pleased with the progress they'd already made, and that thanks to the survey they had clarity about direction of travel. And they said they aim to involve small groups, develop engagement of children and youth, increase communication, and in fact they mentioned the C of E Creation Tide resources. From the youth update, which is on their website, their youth were going to focus on these 3 projects, and I just thought this was wonderful. One is that they're making eco bricks, so back to my Salisbury reference earlier, but they are collecting wrappers and so on that are not easy to recycle and turning them into eco bricks, which can then be used as a brick in buildings projects or to create benches, raised flower beds, play parks and so on. There is a website specifically on eco bricks. They've been stitching crisp packets together to make blankets, also on their website. I didn't want to copy photos from there with people in them, but they've been making crisp packet blankets for homeless people and so on. And then they looked specifically at reduce, reuse and recycle, and really explored, I think, through that fair trade. And they also looked at having a vegan month at church. It was just very clear that their youth are really helping to motivate and galvanise the rest of the congregation. And I know, you know, as I said, lots of us might not have youth or young people in our churches, Maybe it's time to look and see what your local schools are doing, and if they're involved in eco schools, perhaps you could invite some of the children in to help you in your churches to look at what's possible. So maybe a bit of an odd one to put in the worship and teaching section, but I really just wanted to emphasize how they got the young people involved in the young people's groups, and therefore had really sort of incorporated it into the whole of their church life. We're going to look at buildings in a little bit more detail in the Net Zero webinar next week. But what I wanted to emphasize this week is that there are lots of smaller and simpler actions that we can tackle in the building section before we even start to look at the heating, lighting and the insulation. And I know that's where we need to get to. We certainly can't get to net zero without looking at those, but we don't have to start there if it just feels a bit too big and a bit too daunting. Measuring energy usage and calculating the carbon footprint, which is question 1 of the building section. Okay, so you might say to me, actually, that sounds pretty technical, but it has got a whole lot easier in the last 12 to 18 months, I hope, because if you're in an Anglican Church of England church, you now have access to something called the energy footprint tool, and you can submit your electricity and gas readings. In fact, I think you're encouraged to do that as part of the parish returns. If you're not a C of E church, and anyway, if you are, you can also use the 360 carbon footprinting tool that we developed with also the Church of England and Climate Stewards. It's on the Climate Stewards website. And that is a more comprehensive look at your carbon footprint, but will tell you the sorts of data that you need to collect. So it no longer relies on you having an expert in your congregation to help you do that. The electricity supplied to our church premises is generated from renewable resources. There are so many more companies now offering green tariffs. I know there may sometimes be questions around how legitimate they are. There are certainly energy companies like Good Energy offering wholly renewable energy electricity, and we can all do that, whether we're a grade 1 listed building or the newest build, and something we can do in our homes too. I've put in question 25 because I've been pleasantly surprised recently to hear how many more churches are switching to cleaning products that are environmentally friendly. I've heard some things over the years that they don't always clean as well, and then somebody's answer was just to do more cleaning, which is fair enough if you like cleaning. But I just encourage you to look at what's on offer on the market and maybe try out even some sort of simple homegrown products, as it were. There's quite a few churches making good progress on that. Also, just to flag, that there are other questions in this section, like switching away from disposables. Now, I know it seems like we've gone back to disposables during the pandemic, sadly, and there are only just places beginning to open up taking reusable cups again. But when hopefully we're able to get back in our buildings and some of those restrictions have gone, can we look at using reusable cups and so on as simple wins? Use of recycled paper, reduction in paper usage. I think that's happened a lot to us as an organisation as we've all been home-based over the last 16 months. Putting cycle racks on your church premises, or if you don't have space on your church premises, I heard of one church that asked the pub next door if they would put cycle racks on their premises for people to use coming to church. And then recycling facilities on church premises. I'll come to that in a second. Just to show you, that's the screenshot from the EcoChurch service, from the EcoChurch survey that takes you to the 360-degree carbon footprinting tool linked on Climate Stewards. So that is now linked from the survey. Not that you have to use that one, but it's there. And then coming back to recycling, this little church, Pitton Methodist Chapel, I can picture where this is on the Gower in South Wales, almost at the end of the Gower Peninsula, quite a remote little church. And they have gone for recycling in a big way. So they have facilities on their church premises, and then they invite members of their community who don't usually attend their church services to come in and bring these items at designated times. So you can see, I mean, they're collecting all sorts of things there, as well as, by the look of it, making eco bricks. Unusually collecting blankets and hollow fill pillows, cushions and duvets. If people have got ideas about where those can be recycled, please do let me know, because I'm even struggling myself with some of those items to know what to do with them locally. Tetra packs and so on have become more recyclable in recent years, and there are other organisations that will take these. But what a lovely service that we can provide in our churches to our local community by acting, if you like, as collecting points for these. It does require resource, I accept that. People have then got to be willing to distribute these items to the right places. But it's, in some respects, a simple thing that we could do. Land is where we're going next. So this third section, you can leave out the land section, just as you can the building section if you're in a church and you don't own or have influence over a building. But we are encouraging churches to answer the land section more and more, really, because even if you have just a small amount of land, there are things that you can do on it. I do use this slide a lot. It's from St James's, Piccadilly, who don't have very much land, but even what they have, they've planted for pollinators, they've created a bog garden and so on. I just wanted to highlight, while we're here in the land section, what the questions look like in the EcoChurch app. So this is the land category, and those are the questions 1 to 16, and you click on each of those questions in turn, and then the question itself comes up underneath with the options for you to answer. I wanted to flag to you that the resources are now linked to the questions. So at the bottom of that slide, you'll see it says land, how to look after land in wildlife friendly ways. We are actually just currently updating all of our resources, which are on our website. But they will still be linked to the questions when we've done that. So if you're in the survey and you're thinking, well, I don't know quite what's meant by this or how to tackle it, have a look at the resources there and then, because they might help. So a couple of quick questions on land. We encourage native wildlife through the provision of the following. Quite a lot of churches are getting children and young people involved in making their own bird boxes, bat boxes, whatever it might be. So there's sort of a mini project there that you could maybe do over a couple of Sundays. Maintaining an area of land for native flowers. We're seeing many more churches doing that now. Often the question gets asked about land looking a bit unkempt or untidy and people complaining about that. We are in the process of trying to develop some signage for our partners in action. That's our conservation work. We work with 19, 20 partners across the country who are Christian landowners who get similar questions. So there may be some signage on its way, just as a simple way of saying to people, we've deliberately left this area unmown because we want to promote wildlife or whatever the language is. And then encouraging members of your local community to use church land for recreation, contemplation and so on. In Ebbsfleet, which I think is, yeah, the next slide, they registered in spring of last year and got their award in the autumn. They've started a community garden project with the Ebbsfleet Development Corporation, and they've said that's going to play a very significant role in their mission and their care for God's creation. So for now, they hope to develop it further. This was written last year, bear in mind, while things were still a bit locked down, but they've got a couple of apple trees and these few raised beds with herbs, potatoes and onions running on Ebbsfleet Green. So that's a joint partnership, and also a reminder that if we don't have very much of our own land, we can look outwards and see if there's another patch of land or our local council that we can work with to help protect and restore other land. Community and global engagement is the fourth category. In some ways the most activist category in terms of campaigning and working with others. Just a couple of questions on this. Our church, either alone or through a network, hosts a green fair, at least annually, less often, or you need to find out. There's usually that option on the survey. And I'll talk just shortly about a church that's really taken this on in a very big way. And then our church participates in campaigns concerning national environmental issues. Again, with COP26 on the horizon, this is something that we can all do this year in a relatively easy way through Climate Sunday, so registering for a Climate Sunday service and committing to take action, which could be committing to get your Bronze EcoChurch Award, and then calling on the government for firmer action by signing the Time Is Now declaration from the Climate Coalition, getting in touch with your MP and just saying just how important this is. There have been a few churches that have got in touch recently who've been asking parliamentary questions via their MPs, which is just fantastic to hear. So yeah, if you haven't done any campaigning, Climate Sunday, this year's COP is a great place to start, but there are always campaigns going on. We not usually running them ourselves, we're doing Climate Sunday with other organisations, but there are, the likes of Tear Fund had the rubbish campaign going for a couple of years, trying to discourage companies like PepsiCo to stop producing single-use plastic. And that's, you can see the options there. Pardon the spelling mistake. Sorry, this is not a very good quality photo, but this is some of the team at Streatley Methodist Church. They are actually a silver awarded church by now. They've been going at this since 2016. Well, I think they've been working on the environment since before that, but they were one of our earliest registered churches. And when they first got their bronze, this is what they said in their response. We celebrated our achievements with an eco weekend, which included a range of talks and multi-faith discussion, and a service at which our biomass boiler was blessed. So they had Ruth Valerio, who presented them with their award, and they got their MPs involved. Then in 2017, they had their second eco festival. That year, they joined with the Woodland Trust's Tree Charter, and they collected hundreds of signatures to promote the conservation and enjoyment of trees. And they cleared their own woodland area of rhododendron bushes. Then in 2018, they did another eco-festival called The Good Life, and they focused on home crafts and the principles of reduce, reuse and recycle. In 2019, they went down the birds, bees and cooking route, and so they focused very much on a plant-based diet and homegrown food. And then last year, as you might expect, turned out a bit differently for them, as it did for all of us. They had a waterways theme, and they explored the problem of plastics polluting canals and rivers. They weren't able to do their outdoor festival, but they put a lot of informative videos on Facebook to those people that would have attended. And they did eventually get round to blessing a new natural play area in their woodland. So it's a church that always sticks in my mind as one that has really embraced the festivals approach. They do it annually, they tend to do it in conjunction with others, and they focus on a theme. It might not be where you want to start, but perhaps, you know, with a year or 18 months of planning, it could be a great thing to do to also link you with the local community. Stratford upon Avon Methodist Church are another church that have done a couple of great eco fairs, and I think we've got some resources coming up soon on our website from them, and some case studies. We're almost there, and I'm conscious we need some time for questions. The lifestyle category, I've noticed actually that churches that seem to do most well in this section usually have an individual or a group who are championing this in particular, your church community becoming more environmentally sustainable. It can be a tough section again, and I think it's all about us trying to do this together. We're doing it in our own homes, but we're doing it together as a church, that we're trying to make these changes in our lives, which are not always easy, as we know. So it might be that you could take a theme for a quarter or something, try and encourage people to reduce, reuse and recycle, which the next question is about. And indeed, this church, Ascension Church Balham, have gone a little bit further and set up a whole parish refill centre where people can come in and refill laundry liquid, washing up liquid, whatever it might be. I absolutely love this idea. I'm really fortunate that we have a refill larder not very far away, and we've now really got into the habit of trying to go and refill as much as we possibly can. And I've thought for a while, actually, this would be a lovely thing for so many of our churches to do. Again, it kind of makes us a bit of a community hub. Yes, it would take a bit of organising, and you have to then, I guess, in a way, set up almost a mini business, but it's something we will explore a bit more in the churches team, and perhaps hopefully provide a bit more advice on further down the line. And that is it as far as a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the categories again, but we've got, I think, just under 15 minutes or so left for some questions. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Helen. Yeah, so it's time for Q&A. So if you go into the Q&A section by moving your mouse around, you can put any questions you've got in there. You can see other people's questions, and you can put the thumbs up next to questions that you are interested in. Whilst you were speaking, Helen, I was trying to keep an eye on all the suggestions that people had put, comments that people had put in the chat. And the biggest barriers that came up most often were around COVID and money and clergy priorities, and how linked those three things are at the moment, because clergy are focusing on trying to reopen churches and bring people back, and focusing on the financial challenges that COVID have brought up for them. And then the most commonly mentioned positives that were helping people were gaining momentum were around members of the community inside and outside of the church, and some interesting examples of people who've reached out to their local transition group, for example, and found supporters for their EcoChurch journey from outside the church community. There is one question so far in the Q&A. I imagine more will be coming in as we speak, which is around somebody who's got a churchyard which is largely maintained by the council, and so the council are setting the mowing regime and the use of weed killer. The church has a small part that they look after. If you've got a situation like that and you're coming to try and do the survey, how should the church sort of answer those questions?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. This came up actually, Catherine, didn't it, at the Land webinar a few weeks ago, I think. There are lots of churches that have got this situation. I'd suggest maybe approaching your council and seeing if they are open to you working with them or encouraging them to find different ways of managing the land. I do think that's always worth trying. St Andrew's Church in Rugby, which is a gold awarded church, they also have a closed churchyard, and they did this with their council, and they were able to kind of come up with a shared approach. And in fact, they've got a whole sort of garden scheme going on there. But I appreciate not every council is going to be open to that, and some of them, again, it will be about money and they'll just want to do it in their way. If you really feel that you can't influence the land section on your own church land because actually it is council owned, then you can leave it out. You know, if there are other pieces of land in your community, like the Ebbsfleet that I highlighted, maybe see if there are other ways in which you can look after land. You still might not want to answer the land section, but I'd encourage you, to see what you can do. If it's a closed door with the council, that's tough, I think. But see what they say, and if they're open to being influenced. A lot of councils, you know, it's a case of departments talking to the right departments, because they might also have other people who are trying to plant wildflowers on their hedgerows and so on in their verges, and then they might have a church's team that are trying to use herbicide. So that's not always an easy thing to tackle. I think just try and get them to be a bit more open-minded.
And it might be worth checking, if you haven't already, whether your council has declared a climate emergency. There is a map that I'm just getting up so I can put it in the chat, where you can search and see whether your local council has declared a climate emergency, because if they have, then it would be quite a simple thing then, hopefully, to write to them and say, we see you've taken this action, we really want to change the mowing regime in our churchyard to manage the land for climate and nature, could you make this change, and link it into the council policy in that way. I've just put a link into the map into the chat. The next question is such an important one. How do you motivate your clergy? What have you seen in your travels around the country around ways where clergy have got on board and got supportive? What makes the difference?
Yes, that is a brilliant question. I think I could do with a minute to think on that before I start saying things off the top of my head. I think one of the challenges on this is that for so many clergy, depending on what generation they are, or rather when they were trained, they may not have had much of this training around the environment in theological college. I think that is beginning to change, but not fast enough. So there are dioceses now deliberately including environmental training for ordinands. So I guess that's tough if they perhaps haven't had to think about the environment in a theological faith context, and that might be where they're at. Maybe take them out for a cup of coffee if they're up for that, or tea, and just try and understand what their thinking is, and then try to help them make some connections between our missional priorities and that this is a part of our mission. It might be that your church operates a food bank, or that you collect for a food bank. Now, the EcoChurch survey won't make all of these links, but we've got, as we know, so many people in this country dependent on food banks because they can't afford food. And I know there are whole social implications here that we can't all solve in one go. But having a healthy food system where everybody across the country can access healthy, sustainably produced food is actually a much bigger macro issue of how our food is grown and how we use our land. And it's maybe not the best example to choose, but if you can start to show them where these linkages are, how much food goes to waste in our society, that is an environmental factor. It has environmental implications. If we can reduce food waste, we can potentially feed more people. So there's that sort of macro scale. It's making the linkages. It's also showing to them that there are people in our communities who, they might be thinking they'd love to see come through the church doors. Well, actually, if you start talking about the environment, which matters to so many of us, people want to hear that. We know that from the reference to the Youthscape Tier Fund report, which we talked about last week. Some high percentage, I'm sorry, I can't remember the figure, of our young people want the church to show leadership on the environment. If that's not a call to action, I don't know what is. The Bible is a call to action too, but I think see if you can have a conversation with them. Sorry, I've already said enough on that one.
The next question says, actually, they're sort of related, the next two questions, one of which is specifically about any advice on how to attract younger people to get involved, as the congregation is mostly older people who can't necessarily take on more of this. And the second one is somebody else who's put a very similar question. It says, our eco team is sadly depleted, our congregation composed of the frail and elderly. How do we attract other people from the village to get involved?
It is hard. I think on the young people, I'm conscious more and more, because we keep being asked about it, about the number of schools doing eco schools, or even if they're not doing eco schools, which is an award in itself, it's on the curriculum. So I don't know if there are services or opportunities in the week where you could perhaps get in touch with your local school and see if they're open to some children doing a visit. I guess my own experience is of a church school, so I appreciate there's a bit more of an open door there than there might be in other schools. But maybe just see, because young people do have lots of ideas and energy, and perhaps they can come in and help you set some direction, but also just come through the church doors and, even if it's, a quick talk to them about church and what you're trying to do and sharing ideas. See if there's some linkage there, or maybe through brownies, scouts, whatever's going on in your local area where young people do congregate and gather. Can you bring them to you, or can you go to them? Can you offer to do an assembly, perhaps at a school? The other one, sorry, about a depleted and ageing team is hard. I wonder if you can perhaps link with another church nearby. I don't know if the person asking the question is perhaps from a rural parish, but you know, is it maybe about trying to do joint services or services in different ways with others? Maybe going and holding a service somewhere in your local community rather than in your building, so somehow you're a bit more visible. Perhaps inviting people into your church to come and spend a Sunday with you and give you some ideas. It's a bigger sort of missional question about growing a congregation, I guess, but maybe going out and being in your community in different ways and just trying to meet people who are already doing environmental work.
I'm going to put links in the chat through to, you've probably already done this, but there are certain national networks which might have a local group near you, and if an environmentally minded group. So I'm going to put links to the chats through to the Wildlife Trust, the Transition Network, UKSCN, which is the Student Climate Network, and XR and XR Youth, because one of the questions was specifically about reaching young people. And so if you've got one of those groups near you, reach out to them and see if there's a connection to be made.
Those are great suggestions, Catherine.
The next question says, is there scope within EcoChurch for individual churches to influence attitudes within the diocese or the wider Church of England? From my experience of living in vicarages, dioceses care about more in saving money when it comes to building maintenance than it does about environmental considerations. E.g., we were unable to convince our past diocese to agree to fit insulating strips to doors and letterbox. So disheartening. I can understand your disheartenment. I'm not sure that's an EcoChurch question.
I was going to say, Catherine, you might have come across this too. I don't think there is an easy answer to this. Dioceses are at different stages, but they should all be starting to work towards net zero. Yeah. And at the very smallest level, some of those actions would contribute to that.
I think a lot of dioceses are changing. There's been a lot of engagement since the General Synod inauguration, February a year and a bit ago. If you're not already, get in touch with your diocesan environment officer, who I'm sure would be interested to hear about what you're saying. Find out whether your diocese has recently passed a motion responding to that call from General Synod. Find out if your diocese has declared, has signed up to become an eco-diocese. There's a list on the A Rocha UK website, and see if you can find out who in your diocese is leading that work. Maybe make a connection there and try and influence that way. Our network of diocesan environment officers are just the most amazing and lovely people. So if you're not already in touch with yours, do find them. I'll put a link to the map in the chat. The next question from Bryony Burton. Do you have any resources you could recommend for new builds? We have bought a plot of land in Woodland and will be building a new church community centre on it. What a lovely problem to have.
Yes, isn't it? I think we're putting together some resources currently around this, but we also have a set of network advisors on buildings. So it would be worth dropping an email to that network. I don't know if off the top of my head if there are people there who've specifically done new builds, but we certainly have eco-churches that have done new builds. So get in touch with us, Bryony, and we'll see what we can point you towards.
How would people find that network? That sounds a useful thing to have.
It does. I will give you the email, Catherine, to share in the follow-up, but it's on our A Rocha UK website.
There's advisor network.
Yes.
Perfect. That in the chat. I'm just noticing that it is just coming up on 2 o'clock, but we have time for one more question.
Catherine, can I just pick up on a comment, because somebody mentioned earlier, I think you mentioned earlier about the pandemic and, you know, that's distracted people and so on. And John has put a comment in here about how COVID and environmental priorities are surely not separate concerns. And I was going to make that point earlier on. I think that is absolutely right. And we are likely to see more pandemics. That's, you know, been said by scientists because of the way in which we are relating to the natural world. There's a lovely paper on Tear Fund's website that Ruth Valerio wrote about this. I'll see if I can find the link for you, Catherine. So absolutely, I think it is very much a way in, to be honest. We're supposedly coming out of the pandemic, but we went into it in the first place, because of the way in which we treat the rest of the natural world.
The next thing is from Angela, recommending books by Ruth Valerio, which I would certainly second, and I'll put a link in the chat through to Ruth Valerio's book Saying Yes to Life, which I would absolutely recommend. That was her book for last year's environmental Lent campaign. And the final thing on the list says, as local homes are unaffordable for young adults in some communities, the people needed to manage churchyards in any way are few. Any ideas? Well, that's a big and systemic problem.
Yes, although like you said, Catherine, about the wildlife trusts and so on, I'm just thinking of Caring for God's Acre too, who are not a faith organisation, very much though are about people going into churchyards to help look after them and look at the biodiversity and so on. So CFGA is a possible source of help. The wildlife trusts may well have people who are willing to get involved. Their first interest might be biodiversity, but they might not be averse to lending a hand to look after the land.
Yeah, let me just put that one final link into Caring for God's Acre in chat, and then I'll bring us to a close. Thank you so much, Helen. You always bring such practical insight and wisdom and examples which are inspiring. There's nothing like a photograph to make you think, oh, we should do that. So thank you so much. And as I said at the very beginning, we've got one more webinar in Helen's series coming up on the link between EcoChurch and Net Zero Carbon, and then we're repeating all 3 webinars again in September, October time. So if you wish that colleagues had been here today, don't worry, they'll either be able to watch the video on catch up, or they'll be able to come in the autumn to the webinar. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, everyone who's joined us today. I will send you round the slides and all those links from the chat, and it won't take very long, but we'll get the videos up on the website so that you can watch them again if you want to. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. Bye.
Thanks, Catherine. Bye. Thank you all.